Welcome to the Happy Employee Podcast, brought to you by Start Within.
This podcast focuses on mental health and is perfect for HR professionals or business leaders that are managing a team. But it's just as suitable for you if you're focusing on your own self-care or finding ways to nurture your own well-being. Listen as we take a light-hearted and upbeat approach to all things mental health, as well as drawing on our own experiences. Enjoy! Hi everyone, it's Mike O'Hara here at Start Within, and we're really pleased to welcome you back to another episode of the Happy Employee Podcast. We're really proud of this episode because we have a fantastic guest in Vicki Vidler, who is the founder of the Consortium for the Prevention of Suicide, which you're going to learn all about when you listen to the discussion that I was lucky enough to have with Vicki. It was really special as well, this one, because we were actually able to meet face to face in a recording studio in East London, and it's just lovely to be able to sit down with someone and have plenty of time to really get into and understand such an important subject, which undoubtedly we were discussing over the time we had together. If you'd like to learn more about the fantastic work that Vicki and the Consortium are doing, and more importantly, get involved and contribute your support, then you can visit suicidepreventionconsortium.org. Final thing to say, and it's an important one, is that this episode does contain, at length and in depth, discussion of suicide. Hello everybody, and welcome to this newest episode of the Happy Employee Podcast. We are really fortunate to have another amazing guest joining us this week. And this is a particularly special episode because we are in person. We're not over Zoom. We are in the same room. We're in a lovely studio in East London. I'm a little nervous because this all feels very professional and very advanced. And the pressure is on, but I'm sure once we get talking, everything will feel entirely more comfortable. So to very briefly introduce my guest before allowing her to introduce herself properly, today we're joined by Vicki Vidler, and she is, well, an amazing individual based on what you've achieved. I'm going to start by praising you, massaging the ego to kick off. In terms of your personal story, incredibly inspiring in terms of how you have taken one of the most difficult things that we could experience and used it to channel this passion and this advocacy around something that we're increasingly looking to understand and contribute towards at Start Within, which is the subject of suicide and suicide awareness, suicide education and prevention. Now, just last night, actually, I was lucky enough to record another episode, which will be going out, if it hasn't already, when you listen to this, with the three dads walking and talking to three brilliant men who have, again, channeled their own experience of loss of their respective daughters to suicide, and use that to not only raise an amazing amount of money, but to really campaign for change within the compulsory curriculum in our schools as related to sort of suicide prevention and awareness. And I wanted to sort of twin that podcast with our conversation today, Vicki, because you have done something that is equally admirable and important, and that is founding the Consortium for the Prevention of Suicide. Just to give a quick breakdown in terms of my understanding of that before I hand over to you and allow you to properly introduce yourself, because these long monologue intros are kind of my trademark, I feel. Probably too long for people. You're looking through the consortium to sort of unlock innovation and resources in the corporate world, to bring people together, sort of public and third sector, and ultimately to sort of share best practice, skills, expertise, and to raise the broader understanding of suicide as a subject, to bring it out into the light, and to try and affect real kind of positive change. That's what I have learned from reading up on your journey to this point, from admiring your work. But it would be great if you could introduce yourself now to our listeners and tell us a bit about your background and also your involvement with suicide prevention.
Sure, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Vicki Vidler. I'm the founder of the Consortium for the Prevention of Suicide, which I founded a few years ago now. And really, it's gone from strength to strength. And the idea of it initially was simply to bring people together, to bring minds together that were very passionate about suicide prevention and just get a conversation going. But eventually that started to grow, and the idea started to grow that actually we could work with industries and use the power of different industries, for example, the security industry, which we work with now, to unlock the skills and knowledge that they have to help not only people within their own industry, but also people outside of the industry. We've got about 50 members now, some very large corporations, which are household names, some are much more smaller family-run businesses. And really, we work with them to help break down the stigma of suicide within their organisations, get leadership to think about suicide and mental health in a different way, and to bring charities, other charities and academia together to think of, innovative ideas to tackle suicide prevention.
And something that jumps out at me straight away, and we'll rewind a little bit after this, but the question's just popped into my head is, it's clearly a brilliant idea and concept, but similarly to when I was talking to the three dads, I find myself thinking, this just seems so obvious to have something like this in place. And you think, why in sort of 2023, or, even looking back the few years when you first founded this concept, why has it taken us so long to establish something like this, particularly in workplaces and convening workplaces, to have a more kind of aligned view and strategy on something that affects so many people?
Well, I think that, there are so many organisations working toward this cause and all doing fantastic work, but there hasn't been that one sort of glue almost that brings it all together. And why it hasn't been done before, I'm not quite sure. I know that obviously there are organisations like the International Association of Suicide Prevention that aims to bring organisations and thinking together, but not quite in the same way as the Consortium. The Consortium is quite unique in that it works with industry and it looks to affect systemic change within the industry. It looks to change really the culture and the way people are thinking about suicide, breaking down the stigma of it. And we're working with the security industry, as I mentioned just now. We are focusing on that industry because there is still a lot of stigma within that. It's a very male-dominated industry, and with that, comes a lot of a feeling that there needs to be strength. There needs to be, that being vulnerable is seen as a weakness, having a mental, being mentally challenged is an illness or a weakness. And that we want to sort of change the narrative around that and tell people that it's okay not to be okay, to use that. I know what's now sort of become a bit of a cliche, but it's true. It's okay not to be okay, and we want to spread that message to everyone and every industry where there might be facing problems with suicide.
Yeah, and when you say, that phrase has been one that people tend to know and some resonate with, sometimes it does feel a little bit cliched, the whole it's okay not to be okay. And, we feel probably societally like people are talking about mental health more now. But I think the difference with what you've done and are doing with the Consortium is that kind of cultural shift. It's not just, a few lone individuals, often driven by personal experience, trying to sort of bring this to the fore and to campaign for change. It's trying to achieve something a lot more aligned, a lot more joined up, and at the kind of industry level, at the organisational level. And again, when I step back and look at that, I think about all the other kind of notable changes we've seen in the workplace over, even the last 2 or 3 years, through necessity, things like COVID, or we look at the last decade when we've looked at the kind of real leaps forward we've made in things like diversity and inclusion. These are things that across this kind of spectrum of the workplace, people are waking up to the fact that this is really important stuff to help people feel seen, heard, included, to keep people happy, healthy, balanced, to enable people to do the best that they can in their job, and equally to have that balance in their personal life. And then you've got this massive kind of taboo sat right in the middle of it, which has historically been mental health challenges, but then even deeper rooted than that, I think, in terms of the stigma attached, is suicide. When we first started to even think about talking about this at Start Within, I felt that stigma. I felt that worry about, am I going to say the wrong thing? Am I going to do the wrong thing? Is it my place to want to talk about this or to write about this or to tell people what they should or shouldn't be looking out for or doing? And as I said in the intro, I think just bringing that into the light is hugely important. And as you say, there's magnificent charities and advocates. I mentioned, the 3 dads I've spoke to, yourself, Papyrus, Samaritans, all these people. But actually, it needs to be something more systemic, I think.
I think it does.
There needs to be that change.
And there needs to be, I think, a real understanding amongst leadership of the challenges that, their staff and their employees face. Going back to the security industry again, staff on the front line, they witness and experience quite traumatic things just through the course of their duty. And so having an industry-wide understanding of that, I think, will really help to shift the policies that will enable staff to get the support that they need, whatever that might be, post a traumatic experience at work, if they do have one.
Yeah, it's a really important point around leadership and management, because you get that trickle-down effect, don't you? We see that in all manner of the kind of training we deliver, even in our small part. Start Within is manager training has become one of, if not the most important arm of what we do, because you see, like it or not, the greatest effect, because management and leadership has a direct influence on the culture of an organisation. I know that word culture, sometimes people are like, oh, that's, I'm not sure about that term, and it's kind of thrown around. And you get that trickle down effect into a team, even if it's just the leader of a small team, that if that person is credible and open and is willing to be vulnerable and is informed, not flawless, not knows everything, but feels empowered, then it inevitably empowers the rest of that team to think, well, actually, if the top of the tree, the people, the boss is talking about this stuff, is open to it, is putting in place things to support us, there's places we can go for information, and that's just openly discussed. Actually, if I do fall on challenging times, it's a hell of a lot easier to say something, because I don't think I'm going to be singled out as the one who's weak or incapable. And vulnerability, anyone who's heard me speak or write, I bore people to tears with it at the moment. I do think that vulnerability is this largely unharnessed superpower that people have, and it's not about spilling forth with your feelings and thoughts and experiences every moment of every day, but if you can let people see that you're human, it makes it a hell of a lot easier for them to talk about their own sort of fallibility or their challenges,
and also to feel confident to come forward with any struggles that they're facing, because it's difficult. There is a real worry, I think, that if you do come forward to your manager or leadership and say, look, I'm really struggling here, I'm finding it difficult to cope, people worry about their jobs. Is my job going to be on the line? Am I going to be seen as someone who's less capable? So I think if that message from the top is really strong, saying, look, we understand this, we want to support you, and we're going to put things in place to support you, that's going to really encourage people to come forward.
Yeah, and you don't want to just be dependent on your manager by chance or by their own experience, being a decent person or knowing a bit about this. You want to achieve a greater degree of coverage and success by bringing it together at the organisational level and making this, as good as you can, a certainty in organisations that they have an understanding of this, they have policies in place, they have education in place. And so much of this, as I said, chimes with what I was talking to the guys about, the 3 dads, because that's what they were looking for, trying to make this something that actually 25, 30 years down the line, we've seen that generational shift, and that could be in the workplace where this doesn't even feel like a big thing. It's just something that exists, that support is there, it's part of going to work, that if you do encounter these kind of challenges with your mental health, even to the point of suicidal crisis, that there is support there, it's understood, it's visible, it's credible. So that's why I really wanted to talk to you, because me as a trainer and an advocate, anyone else who does stuff like I do, it's great, it's laudable, the stuff that individuals are doing, and often driven by really difficult personal experience, but I wanted to talk to people who are driving kind of systemic change, and that's why I think what you've done is amazing, particularly based on what has driven your desire to do this. So I said if we could rewind a little bit.
Sure.
What did kind of prompt your desire to found the consortium and just to get involved with the subject of suicide prevention, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm very sort of what I want to share my story, around it, because I think that's an important part of the journey and why the consortium exists. So it's 2019, my brother took his own life. He was 5 years younger than me. He was 30 at the time. And like a lot of families that have a loved one that take their own life, you want to do something about it. And I sat down with my family, said, look, we need to do something about this. Didn't quite know what, but sort of months passed, and I had this idea that, as I said before, there are lots of different organisations doing things, but I think there needs to be something that brings it all together and does look at that systemic aspect of suicide prevention. And that's where the idea of the consortium came through. Consortium, consortia is a Latin word, bringing people together, and that was really the sort of ethos behind it all, is how many people can we just get together speaking about suicide prevention and start off a conversation. It was admittedly, setting up the consortium in the beginning was a bit of a lonely journey, because it was me sort of working long late nights, formulating a vision, a mission, a strategy. But as I spoke to more people about it and got interest in it, it became, I just received so much support, and it was almost like, trying to bang on an open door. There were lots of people out there, surprisingly to me, that wanted to help.
Yeah. And something that strikes me when I speak to those who have been bereaved by suicide is the question that I often have is, how much did you know about suicide before you experienced your own loss? Because reflecting as I do, it strikes me that suicide at the kind of societal level is something that's so underrepresented in our kind of discourse, misunderstood. There is so much myth, or just an entire sort of absence of knowledge, a lot driven by taboo, stigma, or simply not having encountered it. So how much did you feel like you knew about this stuff before it sadly kind of occurred in your life?
Well, I didn't know much at all about it, which is a frustrating part of the whole, the whole thing, is because there's so much knowledge out there, so much information. But until you are in that situation, you don't go out proactively looking for it, and you don't even know where to look for it. My brother Adam, he sort of went through depression for a good 10 years. And we knew he was a high risk of it, but we just didn't have the information at hand to help us. When we reached out to various different places, yes, there were bits of help, but they didn't quite seem to sort of fit what we needed or work for what we needed in our situation. And we felt disempowered as well. We felt like there's nothing we can do here. What can we do to help him? We've tried inviting him out to different places to take his mind off of things. And it was all things that were just not going to help. But I think if we had the information beforehand, we could have really put some of that towards helping Adam. But yeah, before Adam passed away, we didn't know much about suicide at all. And I think that's one of the sort of greatest frustrations of this whole thing, really.
And by all means, if I ask any questions that are too personal, please tell me. That's not a problem. But is it something that you, as a family, or you in your own sort of circle of friends, would talk about, or even now find comfortable to talk about? Or is it still something that you see people sort of shift uncomfortably when you perhaps mention that word, suicide?
It really varies. There are some people that... I say most people are comfortable with talking about it and being open about it. But yeah, there's definitely some people I've come across that they will just completely shut down for whatever reason. They will have their own reasons for doing so, and I need to respect that. But yeah, I've certainly had people just say, no, don't want to talk about it, even hang the phone up on me when I've tried to talk to them about suicide prevention and the consortium. Wow. Yeah, that has actually happened. I think a lot of that is to do with the stigma and the taboo around it, because only up to relatively recently, really, it was still considered a crime. Yeah. And there's still a lot of stigma around religion, and it's just I think only now we're starting to talk about it so openly. We've done really well with talking about mental health, but I think now specifically suicide, it's been spoken about more and more, which is a good thing.
Yeah. And do you think that society understands the scale and the prevalence of suicide in terms of how common an occurrence this is?
Honestly, I don't think they do. So the Consortium recently made a video to raise awareness of suicide. And at the end of that video, there's a sort of a line that talks about the statistics from the World Health Organization. And it's every 40 seconds somebody takes their own life. That's a global statistic. I think in the UK, it translates to about every 2 hours, every 2 or 3 hours. I mean, that's shocking. I really don't think people understand that. And then for every suicide attempt, there's about 20 suicide attempts. And many of those result in hospitalisation and, have life-changing consequences, not just for the person that sadly tried to take their own life, but also for the families as well. And I don't think people understand that or are aware of that. I think if they were, there'd be a lot more uproar and people sort of, looking to policymakers to say, what's going to change here? Why isn't anything more being done?
Because if there was any other cause of death that was so prevalent and what might be counted as something that is a source of sort of preventable deaths as well. And I know that phrase will land differently with different people, but we understand, if we don't think it's preventable, then we shouldn't be campaigning for suicide prevention. So we have to be of the understanding that suicides are preventable. And I know chatting between us before this, we both very much believe that, and that's everything that drives what you do. I think I was going to be quite kind of critical there, but we're all a part of it. But I do see it as a great failing of us as a society that there are so many people who are struggling with things like thoughts of suicide, even suicide attempts, those that are affected by a loss through suicide, so family, friends. We understand that ripple effect is huge. We understand that those who are bereaved by suicide are immediately kind of elevated in their risk of suicide attempts themselves. And some of the statistics, when you say them to people, they sit back and they go, wow, that's shocking. It could be, I was saying to you earlier, I'm 33, I'm a bloke, sat here today, the most likely thing to kill me is myself, statistically. Again, referring to my chat with the dads, the one that really punched me in the gut was 200 school children a year we lose through suicide. I think the statistics are so powerful, but also I don't think always statistics on a page or on a screen represent the human cost that those who are coming to terms with that feel, or if the workplace or the community around that person or the educational institution, the effect that we see there.
I don't think statistics are enough.
No,
because they don't really. You can see a number on a page, but it's sort of like, what does that mean? What did really make an impact actually is the Consortium delivered a seminar, an education seminar in collaboration with the University of Westminster. And Dr. Jay Mackenzie, who ran the session, she put up a slide with a packed stadium. I think it might have been Twickenham Stadium. And she said, how many people do you think are in here roughly? And she said the number. I think it was, this is where my rugby knowledge is really bad. I think it was about...
I'm a football man, don't look at me.
Okay. I think it holds 90,000. I might be wrong,
sounds
but
about right,
something like
stadium.
that. And she said, this is just a small part of how many people are lost each year to suicide. And when you saw it like that, a packed out stadium, you think all those people are just disappearing from the world, from our lives, because they've reached a point of struggle, crisis. And as a society, we absolutely have a responsibility to do something about that.
Yeah. And the way that I've come to understand suicide and to talk about it that I think is useful and helpful is not to see suicide as someone that wants to die and it to be forever. That's far outweighed from the anecdotal experience I have and the conversations I've had by people who would describe their pain, their emotional pain. It is that I am in pain, and this feels like the only way that I can be out of this pain. And I think that's something slightly and quite actually different to someone who wants to die and that to be forever. And we forever hear from amazing suicide survivors who will talk about that fact. Linking into that and talking about the kind of ripple effect on people and the fact that this can be, a situational experience for people and how people move on from these things. Wrapped up in all of that, I did want to ask, before we get into some of the broader work around the consortium, just again on you personally, the effect that you've had from that, your kind of personal experiences with mental health. You indicated it was something you were sort of happy to talk about. And I always think that for those people that are comfortable talking about it, we sometimes underestimate how powerful it is for that person sitting listening to hear someone talk openly. So I just wondered what your kind of reflections were on your own experience actually personally.
Yeah, there are three sort of very distinct events, I would say, that sort of led to my own sort of personal crisis. And one was, I was very young, I was only 14, and I just couldn't, there was things going on at home and stuff, and I just couldn't see a way out. And I look back, talking about children taking their own lives, I look back at my 14-year-old self and I think that would have been absolutely the wrong decision for me to make. But couldn't see any further. I didn't know what life I could have had. You're 14. You've got a very small world at that point, which is why I think with children, education in schools is so vital. That really needs to happen, and it needs to happen urgently, because we're seeing more and more children, unfortunately, succumb to this, and social media isn't helping at all. There's some awful things on social media that I have personally seen that's just it's not good. So I think action needs to be taken on that very quickly. But then sort of later into my adult years, I had two sort of other episodes where it was a case of not being able to cope with what life was throwing at me. I'd reached the point where I've just taken on too much and I just couldn't cope emotionally with all of the things that were going on in my life. And I got to a point where I was like, well, this is the only way out. Like I can't see any other escape route. And it is that, for me personally, and this is my view, not sort of reflect anybody else's, but it was that tunnel vision at that time where I couldn't see anything. And what made a difference, I think, in them was other people's kindness, because coincidentally, they didn't know what was going on with me, but at both of those times, somebody did sort of reach out to me and just say, "Oh, hi Vicky, how are you doing?" And it gave me that time to just pause and think, actually, I don't want to do this, and just reset the button, and almost like a pressure valve, releasing itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting and timely, that final point you made there around the kindness of people on the periphery, because I was reading actually, and I encourage people to read, there was an opinion piece in The Guardian just 2 days ago, and it was titled, and it caught my attention, how important the kindness of acquaintances is in recovery. And the point that the writer was making was that we have our kind of immediate support network, and that might incorporate professionals, which is really important. It might incorporate medication, it might incorporate therapies, it might incorporate the family and the friends, the immediate support network. But what this particular writer had acknowledged in her own crisis was how impactful the kindness of people on the kind of periphery was. It could be, like you say, someone noticing that you seem a bit off at work and asking you how you're doing. It could be someone who momentarily distracts you with a conversation about the football last night or what you were watching on Netflix. Someone who notices that you're quiet and invites you out for a coffee, and you don't necessarily have to get down into the nitty gritty of what you're going through, but it's just to feel a sense of connection. And that's the word. 100% what was reflected in this article. And I think I was just smiling when you were saying that, because I was literally reading it yesterday. And
connection.
Yeah.
Connection is key, because I think when you're in that crisis mode, you're disconnected. And so if you can have any human connection, whether it's just a smile. I remember actually a lady smiling at me not smiling at me, it sounds a bit creepy, but she smiled at me in the supermarket line. She might have seen that I was stressed or something, but just that smile, it brought me right back to where I should be. and we need to cultivate more of that connection. And going back to, I'm going to sound like a Luddite, complaining about social media, but I do think that takes away a lot of the connection, and there's just so much on there that's fake and not real. And young people in particular are aspiring to things that are just nonsense. They're not real things to aspire to, but social media makes it out to be. So I think, especially our generation, I think we've got a responsibility, because we're in that middle range of having grown up with a bit of the social media, but we know life before social media as well. I think we've got a responsibility in our generation to start bringing back connection, human connection.
Yeah, and I will talk until I'm blue in the face about peer support and how impactful that's been in my own recovery from challenges and the conversations I've had with countless people over the years. And as I always say, peer support, sometimes people hear that and they think it's a very kind of specific and technical term. It means that you have to go and sit around in a group, or be a member of a certain club, or you have to prescribe to a certain view on things. Actually, what is peer support? It's feeling a sense of connection with someone else, whether it's remotely, whether it's in person. People get that from all different manner of things, but it's feeling seen and heard and valued, and like someone at least wants to understand where you're coming from. And for someone who's in suicidal crisis, it's very rare that we'll be able to sit there and say, I know exactly how you feel, or I know exactly what it's like, or I know exactly what you're going through. But you can at least empathize with the fact that they're going through a difficult time, and to show your desire to understand. And I think for someone who will feel the most isolated you can feel, which is, that individual in suicidal crisis, in that much emotional pain, that does see only one route out of that, and is scared and is fearful and feels like they're being judged, or they're not meeting up to whatever ideals that they think they have to. Just letting someone know that you don't judge them for it and you want to understand them is the first huge step we can take in any journey towards kind of supporting someone who's in suicidal crisis.
I think so. And someone made, sorry for interrupting,
no,
but
go for it.
Someone made a really interesting comment on because we just made a film to raise awareness of suicide prevention, and someone made a really interesting comment about it, and they said, it's great that you've at the end put a line in to say, please reach out, here are the numbers to contact. But there also needs to be a line to say, please reach in if you know of someone that's in a crisis. And that actually, I thought that's really true, because if you're in a real crisis situation, you're probably not going to reach out, call numbers. And I mean, some will. But when I was in a crisis situation, I was not in the right headspace to be reaching out. I needed someone really to reach in, and luckily I did have that. So there's a real onus and responsibility on others to be just mindful of each other.
Yeah, and I think people fear saying the wrong thing. There's a lot of myth around, if I ask someone about suicide, am I going to put the idea in their head? Am I going to encourage them? Am I going to offend them and trigger them? Now, we need to be respectful and conscious of people's prior experience, and to approach it sensitively. But at the same time, I think sometimes that's at the disadvantage of normalising conversations around suicide. We've talked about how prevalent it is. Something I've talked about before, and I will mention again for anyone listening, is that over 20% of us will have thoughts of suicide in our life. I actually prefer to see that as an encouraging statistic, and bear with me when I say that. What that can show people is that if you're having those thoughts, that's quite normal to feel that, and you aren't in the huge minority. You're not weird or weak or incapable or not good enough or indulging yourself. You shouldn't feel any guilt or shame about that. Actually, a lot of people have those thoughts. It doesn't necessarily advance to attempts or even deaths through suicide. So I think, reaching out to someone and saying something and showing your concern and being comfortable to actually use the word, and to show, look, I'm not scared of this conversation. I'm not going to try and tell you to do something or not to do something. What I'm here to do is try to help you feel less alone, and to listen. And hopefully we can at least pause and talk it through and say, what's brought you to this point today? I want to understand, and what can I do to walk alongside you and maybe find something that just makes that pain a little less intense for the moment. And I think that a lot of people won't engage for fear of making it worse, for fear of saying the wrong thing. Clearly, there is a space for professional support, and that's where we should try to signpost someone to as soon as we can. But if every person were to feel like they could reach in and just say something to garner that connection. And then on the flip side, if an individual felt like they could reach out to the people around them, and that's what we talked about with leadership and empowering people, God, we could certainly redress some of those statistics that we see. I wanted to ask you now a little bit more about the consortium as well, because I want people to go to your website, I want people to support the consortium, and I want people to get involved in this sort of drive for systemic change, because it seems so blindingly obvious that there is so much we can do to help people. So you obviously had this desire to advance change based on the loss of your brother. Mm-hmm. How did you find the process of starting that? How challenging was that? Did it help? And how? And the growth of it. What's that sort of journey look like for you? I know you mentioned it took up a lot of your time. If you could tell us a bit more about the experience of the consortium to this point, that would be brilliant.
Sure. So in a word, it's been a tense journey, I would say, because there's always this conflict between wanting to set up the consortium completely independent of my own experience, because I think that's really, whilst my own experience was sort of the genesis of it, I didn't want it to be the reason for it to be continuing, because I feel, I don't know, this is just my own personal view, but I just feel like if I brought my own emotions and my own journey into it, it would sort of detract from what I wanted it to achieve. So there was always that tension there between keeping it completely independent of my own emotion and my own experience with my brother. And there was also a bit of tension, I think, between keeping it, if I'm going to be really frank here as well, making sure that any credit that the consortium received was directed at the consortium and not me.
Totally get that, yeah.
So that was always a conflict in my mind, and believe it or not, that would play on my mind quite a lot. And the other thing that would play on my mind quite a lot was, and somebody said this to me, which I found quite upsetting at the time, but I sort of managed to get over it, was somebody said to me, well, why are you doing this now? Adam has passed away. Somebody said that to me. And they were saying it through emotion. They were upset as well. So I've got to understand and realise that. But that was always playing on my mind as well. It was like, well, I wasn't able to help my brother. So what makes me think I'm able to help people now? And I had to really challenge that attitude that I was creating within myself. So I think it was fraught and tense, certainly, and has been throughout the whole thing. But at the same time, I was very determined to put something together that would be different from anything else that existed out there. And I worked, the first year, certainly, I was working really long hours into the night. I would put my baby at the time to sleep, and then work from sort of 8 p.m. to 2, 3 a.m. in the morning, brainstorming, coming up with ideas, thinking, who do I need to network with? Who do I need to contact about this, that, and the other thing? So it's been also physically exhausting, I would say. And that, going back to sort of my own crisis, I think that led to a bit of burnout last year.
Sure.
So when setting up any sort of endeavour, I think it's really important that you have support around you and that you don't feel like you have to do it all on your own, or that you're responsible for everything. And that's why I'm so grateful to the committee and the trustees, because we work together as a real team. And yes, I founded the consortium, and up until recently I was the chair of the board of trustees, but it's a team effort. So, hats off to everybody that's been involved in it so far.
And do you think it's helped you to process the loss of your brother?
I feel like I wouldn't say process the loss of my brother, but I feel like I've done my duty almost, because I've had this experience. I know what it feels like to be bereaved by suicide, and I understand some of my brother's journey, not all of it, because we didn't talk about it, but about his struggles, which is something I wish we had done, but we didn't talk about it. So I understand a bit of what he went through, not everything. So it's helped me in the sense that I've been through this, I can help others, But I'd say in terms of the processing of my brother's grief, really what helped with that is time. You know, time is a great healer. That's really true. But also self-care, that's really important. And meditation has been a huge part of getting through the grief, and writing as well. So I do a lot of poetry and, you know, writing down feelings and thoughts. And looking back actually at my diary sort of a few weeks and months after Adam passed away, there were some really dark thoughts in there. You know, I was not in a good place. But again, when you're in that place, sometimes you don't realise just how dark things are. And I didn't realise, only looking back at what I was writing, I thought, you know, this really dark place.
Yeah. And is the writing and the meditation, are they things that you started to do following the loss of Adam, or were they things that you'd always done and have helped you to stay well? Because I'm always interested to know, you know, people's journey with their own self-care and how they arrive at things that they find beneficial, if there's other things that they try that perhaps don't do what they need them to. Because I think that self-care, we talked about social media, my sort of, again, maybe slightly cynical view on self-care, as someone who founded a company pretty much on the basis of self-care, it's called Start Within, is that sometimes that phrase does get co-opted as a certain thing for a certain person, and it's kind of hashtag self-care, and it's spa days, and it's wellness, and it's all those things.
do spa days.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with spa days, but I feel like sometimes people will feel like a certain thing represents self-care, but it's such an individual thing. For some people, self-care is just getting enough sleep. And I know, we're both
absolutely.
parents of young children, so maybe we don't go in for that one too often, or we don't get to. For some people, it might just be giving yourself permission to take a break, take a day off. For some people, it might be poetry, meditation, jigsaw puzzles, Xbox, whatever it might be. So just interested to know if that was something that you found helped to sort of bring you through, or if it's something that, you know, you were searching for a relief from, you know, those difficult emotions.
Do you know what? It's just having this conversation just now has just sparked a thought in my mind, which I never had. And that is that, yes, I've always turned to self-care, but when I'm having a tough time.
Yeah.
And actually, if I maintain that self-care, maybe I wouldn't have those tough times, or have less, or they'd be less intense. So I've just learnt something just right now that is something I need to maintain and do all the time. Because the meditation, for example, after Adam passed away, I was doing it religiously, you know, every single day, twice a day, doing this, the same meditation. And it really did help, because it just cleared my mind. It gave me that time to pause, which we were talking about earlier. And then things got better, and then it sort of faded away and stopped. So I think self-care needs to be maintained. It needs to be a continuous thing. Yes, of course, reach out for it when you're finding things difficult. But I've always sort of been a meditative person. And it doesn't have to be, you know, sitting there chanting something or doing a mantra or breathing. It could be, you know, archery, for example. My husband likes archery, and he calls that his meditation. It's anything that allows you to just have your mind on a single thing, rather than having all of these different thoughts taking over you.
And that's what we try to convey a lot in these podcasts and in the work we're doing, is to try and, again, make this feel accessible. And for a lot of people, their meditation, whether they realise it or not, might be, as you say, walking the dogs, or reading a book, or getting some sleep. Sleep's the best meditation. The Dalai Lama said that, so you can take that with some credibility. He knows a thing or two about meditation, I think. So yeah, it's very much not a one size fits all thing, and everything you said around kind of maintaining it is absolutely something I'd agree with. I'd add a couple of things to that. The first is, it's easier said than done to do that. You know, real life gets in the way. I'm sure, you know, when you're absolutely exhausted and your little boy isn't going down to sleep, and you finally get him down, you've had a hard day at work, maybe that's when you don't necessarily feel like sitting and meditating. That might be when you feel like just slumping in front of the TV, and that's fine. And I think we need to, you know, be realistic. But I totally agree with the ideal approach, really, if we can achieve it, is to use it as something to give us capacity.
Yes.
As opposed to trying to use it as something to cure stress, because life's going to be stressful, like it or not. Bad things will happen, unfortunately. Stress will present itself. The modern world is incredibly hard to deal with, I think, more than ever. It's very saturating and overstimulating, and there's work, and there's economic crisis, and there's social media, and there's political instability, and there's COVID. Actually, we're not going to be able to clear all that off the slate. So instead, what can we do to grow our capacity to eke out a bit of space, I think, sometimes? And that's what self-care can be, this kind of preemptive, preventative thing. But it's easier said than done. I bang on about this stuff all the time, and then I know for a fact I'll have a beer instead of going for a walk, you know.
Yeah. I think that word you just used there is really interesting, capacity, because when I had the burnout last week, it was, my capacity had just been breached. And the meditation will, whatever it is, walking the dog or whatever it is you do to sort of take that time, it does exactly that. It gives you that capacity to be able to cope with life's challenges.
Yeah.
It's not a cure-all. Of course it's not. It's not going to, stop the bills from coming through the door or stop, problems in a relationship. But it does give you that headspace to just stop and think and reset.
100%. And we can translate that to the topic of suicide and suicidal crisis that we've been talking about today. I know that things like safety plans are used a lot, really successfully, for those who have a kind of history of suicidal crisis. And essentially what that is often it's a physical document that essentially identifies, okay, these are the kind of things that tend to trigger those thoughts or those really difficult periods for me. And ahead of time, preventatively, I'm going to look at what I can do to pause that, to perhaps buy a little bit of capacity to allow me that headspace to think, to know who I can speak to in that moment that will help me feel better, that activity that I can do that will distract me, those practical things I can do to keep myself safe. And it's kind of building out a plan for that eventuality. And again, it's this preemptive, preventative stuff. And there's a school of thought that we should all have that, regardless of whether we have a history of suicidal crisis or not, that ahead of time, if we had a kind of go-to plan for, if I encounter difficult moments, these are things I know that in the immediate term, in the medium term, and in the long term can help, even if it's just to distract for a moment. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that that can be really sort of beneficial. So this idea of capacity to cope, I'm always aware that I'd like to think that we do more in life than just cope, but sometimes that's where we need to be.
Sometimes that's exactly.
Keep your head above water.
Sometimes that's where you are at that point where all you can do is cope. And if you've got the tools available to do that, then that's going to go a long way in potentially saving your life, another person's life. And I think that's where education is really important, again, to make people aware of the tools that are available. And it feeds into the whole mental resilience piece as well. We should be teaching children, adults, organisations about how they can work on their own mental resilience.
Yeah. And I think, making that age appropriate and making that, credible, I can't see an argument against that. And I know some people may rail against that and think, these are young people, we shouldn't be introducing them to this stuff. Or I hear that kind of opinion of, well, youngsters today aren't as resilient as they once were. Even if we accept that as the truth, which I don't think it is, but even if we accept that as the truth, are we just going to complain about that? Or are we going to do something to say, okay, we're seeing that trend amongst our younger people, probably because they live in a more overwhelming world than once was in a lot of ways. We've talked about social media. How are we going to give them the tools to find the capacity to cope with what is a stressful and a particularly anxiety-inducing, uncertain, changing existence? So I think it will absolutely resonate when you listen back to what the conversation I had with Tim and Andy and Mike, who are doing that fantastic work inspired by their daughters. That's everything they were saying as well, is age-appropriate, kind of credible, inclusive education from an earliest stage. And it's little and often, as opposed to trying to deal with crisis when they present themselves. And that's why everyone has a part to play in suicide prevention. And that's why, yet again, I can only commend you for the approach you're taking to this, although I feel like I would have been really daunted by the prospect of what you decided to take up and run with in terms of, aiming this at the organisational kind of sector level as well. That's kind of where I wanted to go, to finish really, the last couple of questions. So with the consortium, as you said, bringing people together, convening ideas and best practice, raising the level of understanding. you mentioned that it's centered a lot, initially at least, on kind of security industry. Are there any other sectors that you're particularly keen to reach out to work with, or where you see a high prevalence of kind of issues around suicide? Where do you see the kind of growth in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, eventually, I would really like the consortium to sort of branch out to other industries. The film industry is a really good example. You know, you think about the impact that watching a film or a program has on you emotionally and mentally. I think there's a lot the film industry can do in terms of messaging, how they message suicide, how they portray people that are going through a mental health crisis. There's a lot of work that can be done there. In terms of industries that I've seen or that I know are affected by high levels of suicide rates, I recently went through the National Office of Statistics. Is it that? I always get
National
Office
Statistics.
of National
ONS,
Statistics, the ONS data, and you can sort that data, you know, according to occupation. And the top industry, I think, was for the last sort of 12 to 24 months, was the logistics, so lorry drivers.
Okay.
That was sort of coming out top. So, you know, it'd be great to sort of reach out to bodies and organisations within transportation to talk about what could be done there, because, you know, I imagine it's a really isolating profession. You're driving a lorry on your own for long hours, and it's stressful anyway, isn't it? Just driving in traffic.
And I might be indulging stereotypes, and you know, we'll take criticism for this if I'm incorrect, but it strikes me as something traditionally quite a male-dominated industry. I know that there's been a real drive to redress the high suicide rates in things like construction historically, which again, male-dominated industry. Things like agriculture and farming, again, quite a male-dominated industry. And this isn't to say that this is an issue that affects only men, but we do understand that 75% of suicides are men, and that statistic translates pretty much wherever you go in the world as well, quite interestingly. So there is clearly a link there to not only those kinds of nature of the work, but also the demographics that we see within that. That isn't to say that there aren't spikes in the data around other ages and sort of gender demographics as well. But absolutely, and the reason I wanted to ask you that question is for anyone listening, we have quite a wide and diverse listenership in terms of in the corporate world, also in things like defence and security. I know we have international listeners as well, to come forward and to get in touch. And I'm sure you'd welcome that, you know, people from different sectors and industries who feel like more could be done and they could lend their voice and their expertise and their skills to this.
Absolutely. I think every industry, number one, has a responsibility to their own employees and staff on this topic.
Yes.
But I also think every industry has something to offer to the wider community when it comes to suicide prevention. You know, there will be skills, there will be knowledge that are inherent to an industry that could be put to good use to help the community. So don't, you know, box yourself in and think, oh, well, what's my industry got to do with this? Because if you really think about it and do a bit of brainstorming, you'll see actually my industry has something to offer. So I would encourage, you know, anybody from any company or industry to sort of really get behind this topic.
And you know what strikes me? There may be people listening who have had their own exposure to suicide, who hearing that might think, well, actually, I might be able to do what Vicky's done, in that, you know, maybe I work in, I don't know, financial technology, or maybe it's someone listening in defence, or maybe it's someone listening in retail. And yes, we don't, as I said, want this just to be the kind of campaigning on an individual basis, but someone might be able to think, actually, for my industry, I've been affected by this. I don't want people to go through what I've been through. Actually, I'm going to be the kind of standard bearer for my sector, my industry, my company. And from that, they might be able to grow that kind of cultural change in league with the consortium. So I think not only the approach you're taking, but your personal story, which is just awe-inspiring in terms of one person with a team, I know, kind of doing this. I hope that we get Vicky's popping up all over the place, who, as again, I refer to the chat I had with the three guys, but that they mentioned that this is a club that they never would have wanted to be in, but they are in that situation and they don't want people to feel how they felt. And I'm sure that's a position, you know, without speaking
Absolutely.
for you, you come from as well. And the more people like you and Tim and Andy and Mike and the other amazing people I meet in this space, hopefully it gets to the point where your voices are so loud that it's unignorable, and we see that systemic change. Because I just think if an alien came down now to Earth and looked at suicide and how it affects us and how common it is, and the fact it affects people of all ages, all demographics, and it's been an issue since time immemorial, since, you know, look back through history, and the way people have suppressed things like trauma, and adverse childhood experiences and all this stuff, they would look at that and think, why is nobody doing anything? Why is nobody talking? You're doing all of this stuff, expending all this energy and money and resource and all these other things to try and keep people well and safe, but why aren't you doing this?
Yeah.
And the more I think about that, the more I confuse myself as to why we don't. And I suppose it's infused with this stigma and this taboo that you're cutting through magnificently.
And we can all be activists, you know, everyone
100%.
can be an activist, even if it's just a small thing like signing a petition, that's you being an activist.
Yeah.
So there's always something you can do.
Brilliant. I think that's a really important message for people to hear. In terms of moving forward with the consortium, I think you mentioned that you've stepped back from the chair position, but I'm sure you have a very still active involvement and vision for moving forward. We've talked about the kind of the sectors that you'd like to see taking this up, but you know, anyone welcome, absolutely, and everyone has a part to play. You also mentioned a couple of things that you've done recently, so I just wanted to give you a chance to tell people a little bit about the video that you've just produced, because I watched it.
What did you think of it?
Do you know what? I've seen quite a lot of stuff like that and would never question the intention. Sometimes whether it lands or not is a personal preference, and that maybe I've become a bit desensitized to things around it because of the nature of the work, but it did really hit home at me. And there's that kind of, it represents a real life experience, which I think does, albeit a reconstruction, it brings that home to you on a different level, as we said, to just seeing statistics on a page, and then also the messages of hope that go beyond it. And what I was going to say is, I remember in reading it, I looked at all the sort of comments underneath as well, and you see how much this touches people, and people who say, I've had an experience like this, or, you know, keep going, and the support seemed, you know, overwhelming. But that's me watching the video. I'd love to hear what you can tell us about it, and where people can check it out, and what the kind of the process was like, and the inspiration for doing it.
Yeah, so we worked with AKT Productions. Mark Bolton, shout out to him, because he's just a fantastic producer. And really what we wanted to do was put together a story, a narrative that somebody in a mental health crisis could relate to. And we wanted it based on real life experiences. So, you know, I set about interviewing various different people to get an understanding of some of the things they went through. So everything you see on there actually did happen.
Okay.
And I think one of the things that the film does really nicely is that it really gets you into Pete's character. Pete is the main guy in the film, who eventually, you know, has a mental health crisis because there's just so much that life is thrown at him. And I think the film does give that person, both in a crisis, but somebody that's not in a crisis but needs to help someone in a crisis, an idea of the struggles that somebody goes through and what could lead up to those moments when you decide that you want to end your life. The music, I think, is done so brilliantly. That music actually was bespoke for the film. And apparently the singer, whose name I can't remember, it's awful, but she had just finished a project with Hans Zimmer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And she just became available, and the lyrics were written for it. And
Amazing.
It's just all put together so beautifully. We've had about 500 comments on the film saying, you know, sort of the rough of it, saying that this is sort of resonated with them, that this has made them think about being kinder to other people. So
Yeah.
we've got that feedback. It's absolutely phenomenal, and it's on YouTube. You can view it on YouTube. You can go to our website and view it, or our LinkedIn page, and you can see it there. So we're hoping it will reach, thousands, if not millions, through the power of YouTube and social media.
Yeah.
And really, the aim of it is to get people to think about being kind to others, but also if you're in a mental health crisis, just to pause and think, is there help out there? Can I reach out for help? And remind them of that spark that, lights their heart. And that is a lyric in the song, actually. So that's why, when I'm talking about it, I refer to that, because I think that's really important. And when you're going through that, if you're just reminded of, even if it's just one thing that sort of lights up your life, that could make a big difference as well. And we've put some numbers to some of the charities that we really respect. The Samaritans is in there as well. So, yeah, we're just hoping that the video can reach as many people. So just asking your listeners if they can share the video as widely as possible. That would be much appreciated.
And we'll include the link to the video and to the website and all of the social media, everything that we can, as well as some of the support links as well, on all the notes for this podcast and everything we share. But yeah, absolutely. I'd encourage everyone to get involved. Last question. For you, what comes next now? Because you mentioned you've sort of stepped back from the chair position. Clearly you are an extremely driven, passionate person in this space, whilst being mindful of your own self-care. I think that you've very candidly talked about and we've acknowledged. What does sort of next look like for you? Is there anything that you still want to do with this, or is it just continuing to build the kind of membership of the consortium and to get this kind of discourse happening?
Yeah, I think it's continuing with the membership, because the more people we've got as members, it's free, by the way, membership is free. The more people we've got as members, that means more people are talking about it and thinking about it. I have stepped back as chair. So the new chair is Ian Dyson, who's the former commissioner of the City of London Police. And I think he's just going to take it, in the direction that it needs to now go. It needs to go up to the next level. And actually there'll be, a strategy coming out sort of towards the end of this year, brand new strategy, but still working on those principal aims that we have around breaking down the stigma and getting organisations to really take responsibility for the well-being and the mental health of their staff.
Amazing. Well, Vicki, thank you so much for your time. I feel like we did okay on video, live, in the same room.
Well done for the first one as well.
With another human being. But no, honestly, I am in awe of what you have achieved. And I know you will not like to hear that. And I know that it's because it's not about you, and you've made that very clear. But without activists like you and your team, systemic change like this just simply doesn't happen. And I feel extremely privileged to have had the opportunity to talk to you and to talk to other people in this space that are doing this work. And I fully intend to get personally and organisationally with us at Start Within further involved in suicide education, prevention, awareness, because there is such an open goal to do good here, I feel, as well, and there is such a need. But I think that, as I would say to anyone who's achieved what you've achieved, never underestimate the impact it has, not only of what you've done, but your willingness to be sort of candid and open in talking about your story and your own experience, because there will be people sat feeling like, I'm the only one, this can't get better for me, no one understands the way I feel. So hearing someone talk as well and articulately as you do, and as powerfully as you do, and with such hope and optimism, I think never underestimate how impactful that is for people to hear that. So thank you so much. Thank you for what you do. I would implore everybody to look up the Consortium for the Prevention of Suicide, to lobby their industry, their sector, to join up, to lend your support and your skills and your expertise to the Consortium, because systemic change can happen here. It no longer has to be one or two lone voices, albeit passionate, campaigning for change, we can make a systemic, a generational change. And people like you will be right at the forefront of that. So a huge thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll chat again soon.
Thank you.